Seraphine Hale had never once walked into the annual claiming ceremony expecting anything good to happen to her. She had attended every year since she was old enough to stand on her own, watched other wolves feel the bond light up between them, watched the crowd cheer and celebrate, and then walked home alone in the dark. It was simply the pattern of her life, and she had long stopped fighting it. She was an Omega in the Ironblood Pack, which in this world meant she was the last person anyone noticed. Not because she was unpleasant or unkind. In fact, most people who actually took the time to speak with her found her thoughtful and warm. But in a pack built on rank and status, being at the bottom of that list meant being invisible. She had learned to carry herself quietly, to take up as little space as possible, and to never let anyone see that the silence sometimes hurt. The night of the ceremony, she wore a simple white dress that had belonged to her mother. It was the only fine thing she owned. She braided her dark hair back and walked to the clearing alone, as she always did. The Ironblood clearing was beautiful at night. Tall trees surrounded it on all sides, and the pack had hung lanterns from the branches, so the whole space glowed warm gold against the dark sky. Hundreds of pack members were already gathered, young and old, families clustered together, children sitting on their fathers' shoulders to see better. It smelled like pine and wood smoke, and something electric in the air that always came with the ceremony. At the front of the clearing stood a raised platform where the pack alpha and his senior wolves sat, and that night there was someone else on the platform too, a guest, seated slightly apart from the others, watching the crowd with dark, quiet eyes. Seraphine glanced at him once and looked away. Everyone knew who he was. King Kale Voss, the Lycan king, was not someone you stared at directly. He had come on a political visit. These were not unusual. Kings occasionally attended pack ceremonies to maintain goodwill and remind everyone of the larger order of things. He was tall and still in the way that very powerful people sometimes were, as if they had nothing left to prove, and therefore no need to move unnecessarily. He was not young, though it was impossible to say exactly how old he was. There was something ancient about the way he sat. Seraphine found a spot near the back of the crowd and waited. The ceremony began the way it always did. The elder, an old woman named Marin, with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood at the center of the ring and called the names of those who had come of age in the past year. One by one, young wolves stepped into the ring. Some felt nothing, some felt everything. And when the bond appeared, it came as a thread of soft golden light, visible to every person present, reaching from one chest to another like something that had always existed and was only now being shown. The crowd would erupt each time. There was genuine joy in it. Even Seraphine smiled from the back, watching others find each other. Then Elder Marin called a name that surprised the crowd. Dominic Ashford was not a young wolf of coming age. He was the newly appointed beta of the Ironblood Pack, 28 years old, broad-shouldered, and the kind of handsome that he was clearly aware of. He had been called into the ring because the elders had seen signs of a bond approaching, one that had been delayed by circumstance and distance. This was not unheard of. Bonds did not always appear on schedule. He stepped into the ring looking confident, almost bored, as if this were just another ceremony to perform. And then Elder Marin called the second name, Seraphine Hale. The crowd went very quiet. Seraphine stood at the back of the clearing and did not move for a full second. She heard her name and felt something strange happen in her chest. A warmth that started small and then spread outward suddenly, like a lamp being turned up. Her feet carried her into the ring before her mind had caught up with what was happening. She walked to the center. She stood across from Dominic Ashford, who was staring at her with an expression she could not immediately read. And then the bond light appeared. It was brighter than most. The golden thread that stretched between them was wide and luminous, and it pulsed with a rhythm that several older wolves later said they had never seen before. Strong, steady, as if it had been waiting a very long time. The clearing lit up with it. People in the crowd gasped. A few of the elders leaned forward. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. And then Dominic Ashford laughed. It was not a small or private laugh. It came out of him loud and sharp, and it cut through the clearing like something cold. He looked at Seraphine the way one might look at an unexpected and unwanted surprise, with open, undisguised displeasure. He looked at the crowd, spread his hands wide, and shook his head. "Her?" he said. Just that one word. Just that simple, devastating word. And then he kept going. He said her name like it was a joke with no punchline. He mentioned her rank, her quiet life, her lack of family, her unremarkable history within the pack. He did not shout it, or say it with venom, which almost made it worse. He said it casually, the way someone might list reasons why a plan would not work. As if she were a plan that would not work. The golden bond light dimmed between them. Dominic stepped back from it deliberately, and the thread frayed and dissolved like smoke. A formal rejection, in front of everyone. The crowd had gone completely silent. Some people looked at the ground, some looked at Seraphine. A few looked at Dominic with admiration they were trying to hide, because he was the beta, and no one wanted to be on his wrong side. Seraphine stood at the center of the ring and felt every pair of eyes on her. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were something she could save for later, for the dark and the quiet, and this was neither. She felt the heat of humiliation move through her like something physical, but she let it pass, and when it passed, she was still standing. She lifted her chin. She turned. She began to walk toward the edge of the clearing. She had taken perhaps 4 steps when she heard it. A sound she had not heard before, a low, resonant tone, almost like the ground itself shifting. It was the sound of a very large, very deliberate person rising from a seated position. Every wolf in the clearing heard it too, because every wolf in the clearing turned to look at the platform. King Kale Voss was standing. He had not spoken, not yet. He simply stood, and somehow that was enough to hold the entire crowd motionless. He looked at Dominic Ashford for exactly 1 moment, not with anger, but with something quieter and more serious than anger. Then he stepped down from the platform. He walked across the clearing with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who has never once questioned whether there was room for him to walk. People parted without being asked. The pack alpha opened his mouth and then closed it again, because there are certain people in the world in whose presence it becomes very difficult to speak. He reached Seraphine before she reached the edge of the ring. She stopped. She turned, because she felt him before she heard him, the same way you feel a change in the weather. She looked up at him and found him already watching her. He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear the first part. "You were not rejected by a worthy man," he said. "You were released from an unworthy one." Then he turned slightly, so that his voice reached the whole clearing. "I am invoking the right of recognition." Even the wind seemed to stop. The right of recognition was not a law that most wolves had ever seen used in their lifetimes. It was older than most pack charters, older than most alliances and agreements. It stated that a Lycan king held the authority to formally acknowledge any individual carrying dormant Lycan blood, blood that had been hidden, diluted, or forgotten across generations, and to declare that individual under the protection of the Lycan throne. It also gave him the right to claim that person as his own, should both parties consent. The murmuring that broke out across the clearing was immediate and disbelieving. Seraphine herself stood very still. She had no idea what he was talking about. She had no idea she had any Lycan blood. She had no idea where she had come from at all, really, because her mother had died when she was small, and had left behind very little beyond the white dress Seraphine was currently wearing. Elder Marin appeared from the far edge of the crowd, pushing through slowly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were bright with something that looked like relief and guilt arriving at the same time. She stopped at the edge of the ring, and did not try to interrupt. Her expression said everything. She had known. For years, she had known, and she had said nothing. King Kale did not rush the moment. He looked back at Seraphine and lowered himself to one knee. The clearing erupted, not in joy, not yet, but in pure, stunned disbelief. A Lycan king did not kneel. It was not a gesture anyone present had ever seen, or expected to see, or would ever fully forget. He knelt in the dirt of the Ironblood clearing in front of a woman the pack had spent years overlooking, and he looked up at her with a steadiness that suggested he had thought about this carefully and decided it was exactly right. "I am not here to replace one person's decision with my own," he said, quietly again, only to her. "I am here to make sure you know that you have a choice. You can walk away from all of this tonight, and I will ensure you are safe. Or you can stay, and we can figure the rest out together. But the choice is yours. It has always been yours." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. She was not a fool. She understood that this was complicated, that it would not be simple, that a king kneeling in a clearing was the beginning of something, not the resolution of it. She understood that she did not know this man, and that trust was something built slowly and proven over time, not handed over because someone made a dramatic gesture. But she also looked at the pack around her. She looked at the people who had stood in silence, while Dominic listed her failures like reading from a ledger. She looked at Dominic himself, who still could not meet her eyes. She looked at Elder Marin, who was quietly weeping, and had earned neither forgiveness nor coldness just yet. And she thought, "I have spent my whole life making myself small, so that other people would be comfortable. I have spent my whole life waiting for a place to belong." She looked back at the king. "I will stay," she said. The pack alpha stepped forward then, his voice tight with anger, wrapped loosely in formality. He declared the right of recognition outdated, symbolic, and without force inside Ironblood territory. He said it politely, because he was not a foolish man, but the challenge was clear. Dominic stood behind him, finally looking somewhere other than the ground, looking, in fact, like someone who had just realized the size of the thing he had started. King Kale rose from his knee. He looked at the alpha without any particular hostility. "Then we will settle it the old way," he said simply. What followed was brief. Pack law allowed a formal challenge when the right of recognition was disputed, to be resolved by combat between the challenging party's appointed fighter and the king's representative, in this case, the king himself. Dominic stepped forward, which Seraphine thought showed either great courage or a serious misunderstanding of the situation, probably both. The combat lasted less than 2 minutes. No one was seriously hurt, but the outcome was so clear so quickly that the defeat was almost harder to bear than an injury would have been. Dominic stepped back from the ring, looking like a man who had just understood something too late. When it was over, King Kale stood at the center of the ring and formally claimed Seraphine before the entire pack. Not as a possession, not as a prize, but in the old Lycan tradition, a declaration of recognition, of intention, of respect. He spoke her name into the night air, as if it were a title she had always held and simply had not been told about yet. Seraphine stood beside him and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was standing in exactly the right amount of space. Afterward, as the crowd began to stir and talk and process what they had just witnessed, Elder Marin came to find her. The old woman stood with her hands folded together and told her what she had never said, that Seraphine's mother had been the quiet, unacknowledged daughter of a Lycan noble, born outside of any formal arrangement, hidden away to protect her from politics and power struggles she had no part in creating. The bloodline had been covered over and forgotten, except by Marin, who had watched Seraphine grow up in the Ironblood Pack and said nothing, because she had told herself, year after year, that the timing was not right. Seraphine listened to all of it. She did not forgive easily. She was not built for quick forgiveness, and she did not pretend to be. But she looked at the old woman's face and saw genuine sorrow there, the kind that had lived a long time, and she said, "I am not ready to forgive you yet, but I am not closing the door either." Elder Marin nodded, and that was enough for now. When the sun began to rise over the Ironblood territory, Seraphine and King Kale walked out of the clearing together. They were strangers in the truest sense, two people connected by something ancient and real, with an enormous amount of time and conversation and ordinary life still ahead of them before any of it became love. She knew that. She was not the kind of person to pretend that a single night resolved anything deeply. But as she walked through the gate of the Ironblood territory with the morning light on her face, she noticed something she had not felt in a long time. She was not making herself small. She was walking at full height, taking up the space that was hers, moving forward into a life that had just cracked open in a direction she had never once imagined. Behind her, the pack watched them go. Not a single person laughed,